Good morning to those on the East Coast of the United States. Good earlier morning if there are some west of here. Good afternoon to those in Europe. I'm assuming we have some zooming in from Europe. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and want to welcome all of you to today's very timely event, Holocaust Remembrance in the Age of Social Media. This topic is very personal to me. I am the daughter of a man who grew up in Nazi Germany, wore the yellow star in medical school, was in the last class, 1934, that Jews were permitted to graduate from medical school. He found his way to the United States through Ellis Island. It's the usual story. Became a prosperous medical doctor in Los Angeles, which is where I grew up, and used to say that growing up behind the little store where he lived as the only son of a widowed mother, he hoped to escape from Germany, maybe get to France. He never imagined he'd get to the United States and have the ability to build a successful career, but have two children, one of whom became a successful medical doctor, my brother, and the other of whom served in the United States Congress. It's a pretty powerful deal. I still get choked up when I think about it. And with each passing year, there are fewer and fewer Holocaust survivors. I'm sure it's now a handful, but it has never been more critical to engage younger audiences on the lessons of this human tragedy, especially in the age of social media. This stunned me to learn this, 50-state survey of Holocaust knowledge among millennials and Generation Z concluded that 63%, is possible, of those surveyed didn't know that 6 million Jews and others were murdered in the Holocaust. What's worse is that half of those surveyed thought the death toll was fewer than 2 million, still a huge death toll. And nearly half of the US respondents surveyed could not name a single one of over 40,000 concentration camps, not even Auschwitz. On top of this, today's social media environment is rampant with anti-Semitism, hate, and disinformation. 20 years ago, we could assume that most students were being exposed to books by Elie Wiesel, whom I actually knew, in history classes, and movies like Schindler's List and Sophie's Choice. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case either. So today's event will discuss the threats social media poses for remembering the Holocaust and how to overcome them. And here to moderate is Teresa Eder, the program associate for our Global Europe program, which is ably directed by Dan Hamilton, who I think is also participating in the Zoom. Teresa will be navigating the discussion among our panelists, one of whom is Wendy Lower, a senior scholar at the Macmillan Center at Yale. She is the John K. Roth Professor of History and Director of the, I think this is a typo, the Center for...
McGrublian, the McGrublian Center.
No kidding, that's a mouthful. Okay, McGrublian Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna in my home state of California. She also chairs the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and served as acting director of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at USHMM. USHMM stands for?
United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
I see. Okay. I've never heard the acronym. From 2016 to 18. It's a wonderful place. I strongly urge anyone who's never been there to get over. We're also joined by Gabriel Rosenfeld, a professor of history and director of the undergraduate program in Judaic Studies at Fairfield University. He's the author and editor of 7 books, including most recently, The Fourth Reich, The Specter of Nazism, from World War II to the Present, and is an editor of the Journal of Holocaust Research and Counterfactual History Review. Lastly, we give a special welcome to Nicholas Potter, who is a British-German journalist, editor, and researcher at the, Amadou Antonio Foundation in Berlin. He's on the editorial team of the foundation's journalistic project, Bell Tower News, and his work focuses on right-wing extremism, anti-Semitism, racism, and conspiracy ideologies in Germany and Europe. Let me just add, even if I've garbled all your names, my apologies. I think what you are going to offer this morning is hugely important. And just thinking about how hard I try to make sure my children and grandchildren learn their grandfather and great-grandfather's lessons to never forget. If that is disappearing in the world, we are doomed to repeat it, not just against Jews, but against all kinds of minorities. And guess what? You know, think about the Uyghurs and think about others. We may be repeating it as we speak. So on that cheery note, over to Teresa to begin the conversation. You're muted.
Now I'm unmuted. Thank you very much, Congresswoman Harman, for your very thoughtful introduction. I'm very delighted that you could join us today, and also for being a voice of conscience on these issues. I think it's very important that we talk about the past. And thank you to everyone who is tuning in on this very important day, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And also thank you to our three distinguished panelists that I will start engaging in a conversation. If you in the audience have a question for our panelists, please email us at gep@wilsoncenter.org. I'm going to repeat it again. It's gep@wilsoncenter.org. And you can also reach us on Twitter, and our Twitter handle is @WilsonCenterGEP. And later on, we'll take the questions. We'll first do a round with our panelists, but then we'll get to our audience questions. So please send them in. So I want to get right to it and situate us in the current moment. As Congresswoman Harman mentioned, this last year, we have seen a surge of white supremacy, conspiratorial thinking, and anti-Semitic hate on full display, not just online, but increasingly also offline. And those also includes attempts to revise and distort or trivialize the Holocaust. Wendy, you've done a lot of work uncovering the historic events during the Nazi era. So I want to ask you a question on the connection between history and the erosion of truth in our present day. Why is it so important for democratic societies to engage with the past and to learn from it?
Thank you very much, Teresa, and thank you, Representative Harman. I'm just so delighted to be here on this day, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and appreciate your words, Representative Harman, as far as the importance of remembrance and the state of affairs today and the challenges that we face. In this question about the neglect of history and remembrance, I guess first of all, we need to distinguish on this day between history and remembrance. They certainly inform one another, but we can better guard against the erosion of truth and uphold the facts of reality in the writing and teaching of history than we can in remembering and memorializing the past. There's been a lot of discussion and analysis about this post-truth world of alternative facts and alternate realities that have led to deep divisions and chaos and violence and been boosting these authoritarian populist regimes that thrive on anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. We've been monitoring this for years, its rise in Europe, especially in Hungary and Poland and Russia and Turkey. And of course, we experienced it firsthand under Trump, culminating in that catastrophe on January 6th. History was not neglected. So the neglect of history is not necessarily leading to an erosion of the truth. On the contrary, history has been weaponized as a battle over my version of events and yours. Although the past should be our common ground and heritage, the past becomes the cause and the battlefield. Many insurrectionists, like history reenactors dressed in militiamen from the Revolutionary War era as self-identified rebels, and patriots who declared that they would take back America. They believe themselves to be saviors of history, fighting to keep their values, including preserving a kind of caste system in the sense that Isabel Wilkerson has written about. So how does this erosion of truth happen and lead to these kinds of conflicts? The RAND Corporation did look into this in 2018. I don't know if you saw this report they did, what they called truth decay, not tooth decay. And they talked about truth decay as the diminishing role of facts and data in American public life. and outline some trends that characterize truth decay. Number one, increasing disagreement about facts and analytical interpretations of facts and data. Number two, a blurring of the line between opinion and fact. Three, the increasing relative volume and resulting influence of opinion and personal experience over fact. Four, a decline in trust in formally respected sources of facts. So most of these trends are not unprecedented in American history, but today's level of disagreement over objective facts is a new phenomenon. And the RAND team looked at how we got here and outlined 4 drivers of truth decay. One, and these are just kind of themes that might inform our discussion today, cognitive biases. Secondly, the rise of social media and other changes in the information environment. Third, demands on the educational system that limit its ability to keep up with changes in the information ecosystem. And lastly, political and social polarization. So there are many forces at work that can lead to anti-intellectualism and the erosion of truth. So a lack of regard for science, a lack of reading, crowdsourcing of knowledge, the diminishing footnote, fatigue and lack of rigor in scholarship, and attacks on the free press and journalism. When we speak of the erosion of truth, we might reflect on the process of degradation. In Orwell's words, the past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became the truth. So when we find ourselves in this realm of a kind of irrational post-truth alternative facts universe, in short, the dislodging and disintegration of history, when all objectivity is mercurial and truth is totally subjective and relativized in false comparison and lies, the past becomes a terrain, a kind of quicksand. We might also ask in this environment, who gains and who loses in this scenario? Because it is about power and struggles over a narrative. Whose truth is being suppressed? And this is what brings me to this day, because when I have more questions and answers today, and when I have these questions, I also often go back to where I feel most comfortable, what I know the most about, and that's about Holocaust and Holocaust history source material. On Holocaust Remembrance Day, I find clues in victims' sources. Victims' stories leave us with the truth of what happened to the Jews, for instance, in the Warsaw Ghetto, not the accounts of the perpetrators. Polish Jews who secretly met to document and archive their experiences for future generations, for us, had lost faith in humanity and felt forsaken, but understood the power of their words as evidence. A Polish Jewish author who was part of the Ringelblum archive collection, Gustawa Jarecka, famously wrote, and she's often been quoted, this is my colleagues Lisa Leff at the Mandela Center at the museum, Holocaust Museum, and Sam Casso have worked on this extensively. But I want to quote this Polish Jewish victim from the Warsaw Ghetto, quote, "The record must be hurled like a stone under history's wheel in order to stop it. One can lose all hopes except the one, that the suffering and destruction of this war will make sense when they are looked at from a distant historical perspective. From sufferings unparalleled in history, from bloody tears and bloody sweat, a chronicle of days of hell is being composed, which will help explain the historical reasons for why people came to think as they did and why regimes arose that caused such suffering." These Polish Jews who secretly amassed the Ringelblum archive assumed that the facts of what happened as they recorded them, their chronicle would be studied and learned from as history, that the passage of time would provide that historical perspective and understanding. They placed their faith in the records, the sources and stories that they collected and documented, that proof of the truth would be lost when all the living witnesses were gone. When Eisenhower first witnessed the horrors when he liberated the camps in Germany, he also worried that this dark, shameful history would be denied as propaganda. There would be a tendency to look away from it and to deny it. The Nazi regime thrived on the big lies that were repeated until they were believed. And in this bludgeoning of falsehoods, they indoctrinated and expanded their base of followers and Hitler loyalists. Historian Richard Evans reminds us in his work In Defense of History that the scholarship we produce must be pursued for the sake of discovery, not as justification, not to champion a cause per se. Historical discovery based on research, careful and critical sifting of sources, and documented perspectives from the time can shine a light on the present, but cannot be a prescriptive device. Historical interpretation should complicate and guard against oversimplifications and faulty comparisons between past and present. But historians are engaged in more than a battle for historical accuracy. Each fact, each biography of a Polish town like Jedwabne, or of a Hungarian gendarme or Arrow Cross member carries important implications for Europe's present. And there's plenty of resistance to these facts. Right now, scholars of the Holocaust, led by Omer Bartov and others, have been engaging in many email exchanges and working on op-eds and various efforts to support Polish historians who are facing increased pressure and a systematic campaign now to destroy them and their research on Polish collaboration. So what can historians do besides this? Elazar Barkan, among others, called for more historical activism and direct participation in public debates and in conflict resolution. I agree that historians, wherever possible, should correct the mistakes and errors and clarify where comparisons with the past are faulty or problematic, and fight against the coarse discourse and oversimplification of the past and the erosion of the truth. Historians could be more deliberate about pointing out the dangers of identity-based history making when history serves ideology rather than critical inquiry. And my last point is when there is no common ground, agreement on the basic facts of the past and trust in those facts as a depiction of reality that has been rigorously established through scientific methods, inquiry, and peer review, when we dispense with that, with centuries of shared knowledge, and with the freedom to critically question and responsibly revise it through the process of discovery, then that void is filled with conspiracies, rumors, a world of speculation, superstition, prejudice, chaos, resentments. And we see how that leads to violent conflict. So I feel like this is the quicksand moment that I feel like we find ourselves in. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. You touched upon how history can be weaponized. And so I want to turn to Gabriel, who's also done some work on this. How we commemorate, what we learn about the Holocaust has changed over time. And you, Gabriel, have written books on that. And your work now is focused on the concept of illiberal memory. So if you could just explain to our audience what illiberal memory is and how it has gained ground in the last decades.
Sure. Thank you very much, Teresa. Thank you, Representative Harman, as well, for your introductory remarks. We're going to have a great discussion today. And I think my approach is to try and extend some of what Wendy was just referring to by looking at the 30,000-foot bird's eye perspective with regard to, Teresa, what you just mentioned, this concept of illiberal memory. I have a new journal article appearing next month with Memory Studies, in which I actually coined this concept of illiberal memory, which to my surprise hadn't been yet coined as an overarching notion. But I wanted to kind of just explain what the argument of the article is and provide some key examples about how it's been evolving in recent years. Illiberal memory is obviously a spin-off of the idea of illiberal democracy. So Wendy, when she referred earlier to the existence of right-wing populist or illiberal democratic regimes in places like Hungary or Poland or Turkey or India, or movements, say, like even in the United States in recent years, that's to make reference to something, a phenomenon that political scientists, historians, and others have been well aware of. Illiberal memory is simply the memory politics that illiberal democratic regimes pursue and have been pursuing for some time. What it basically is a very strong right-wing backlash against what's been called the memory boom of the last generation, a liberal approach to remembrance that most of us have long subscribed to and very much endorsed. And it's a very worrisome phenomenon that I want to just kind of typologize a little bit with you in my 5 to 7 minutes of comments with regard to the larger strategy that illiberal Democrats are pursuing and the tactics they've been employing as well. It's worrisome because for the last generation, liberals who have promoted consciousness of the Holocaust and remembrance as a virtue one way or the other, liberals believe that the more memory we expose ourselves to, the more we would be able to keep history from repeating itself. What we of course have seen in the last 5-10 years with the surging movements of right-wing authoritarian movements and regimes across the Western world is that the political right is ascending now despite all the memory work that's been done. in the last generation, which sort of, separates the notion associated famously with George Santayana that, if we do remember, we won't repeat the past. Now we seem to be in a situation where a lot of liberals are wringing their hands, criticizing themselves, saying we didn't do enough, because had we done enough, you wouldn't find Viktor Orban and the Kaczynski brothers doing their thing, and Vladimir Putin and so forth. So let me add a little bit more background to sort of my overarching thesis about what illiberal memory is and how it relates to illiberal democracy. Social scientists, historians, and others have sort of made the obvious point that illiberal democracy is basically a global response, at least in the Western world, to the upheaval caused by globalization, the globalization of economic, capitalist forces, the globalization of migration streams, of refugees and immigrants from all over the world. And illiberal democracy can be seen as a protectionist response of the nation state reasserting its sovereignty against globalizing phenomena. By the same token, I think it's safe to say that illiberal memory is a protectionist response against the liberal memory boom, the globalization of Holocaust consciousness, the globalization of the need to remember. A lot of nation states, a lot of people on the right, it's not only the far right, but the moderate right as well, they've said, you know what, enough of this. We want to assert a national form of memory. And if that requires us to go against liberal prescriptions about never forget, then so be it. Or to put it differently, if liberal memory has long argued that a self-critical approach to the national past, a balanced, nuanced, not a whitewashed view of the national past, if that's a positive thing for a nation's sense of self and identity, well then now self-critical memory is being replaced by a self-assertive, triumphalistic form of memory by nationalist movements that want to only look at the good side of things. So the strategy, the overall strategy that these illiberal democratic movements and regimes have been pursuing is very simple. It's a twofold strategy. On the one hand, it's defined by what I call mnemonic negationism, overthrowing, rejecting any tendency to self-critique, to focus on, let's say, the crimes, the misdeeds, the mistakes that have taken place in the national past. You've seen that, of course, this past summer with the George Floyd protests and Americans debating the question of how much should we be talking about slavery and the Confederacy and the Civil War and so forth. And I'll talk in a minute or two about former President Trump's 1776 Commission and the desire for patriotic history. But the first strategy, in other words, of a liberal memory is to reject liberal approaches to remembrance, self-critical approaches. The second plank is what we might just call mnemonic affirmation, the idea of normalizing the national past, only focusing on the positive elements that promote self-esteem and so forth. So it's negationism of the enemy's approach to memory. It's the affirmation of our positive view. And then in the couple minutes that I have left, I thought I would just go through the 6 or 8 tactics that you find, basically defining illiberal memory practices anywhere, whether it's the United States, whether it's Hungary, whether it's Germany, whether it's India. You find the same kind of larger phenomena, and I'll just sort of itemize a couple of them. The first tactic is that illiberal Democrats always want to reverse the narrative between guilt and innocence. And they want to reject any effort to show that there is anything to feel guilty about in the national past. And they'd rather promote a view of the past that is all about victimization, innocence. So for example, the AfD in Germany has gone on record very clearly rejecting Holocaust education and the idea of focusing on Germany's Nazi experience as part of a guilt cult, or what the PIS in Poland has called a pedagogy of shame. A second strategy, beyond merely reversing the liberal approach towards guilt and innocence, is to appropriate Holocaust terminology for their own ends. And it's interesting how Holocaust consciousness, as it emerged in the 1990s, after the turn of the millennium, became appropriated in various ways by right-wing regimes, so that pretty much everybody now wants to be claiming that they're the victim of genocide. Right-wing nationalists who have been protesting in Dresden for years have referred to the firebombing of Dresden in February of '45 as a bombing Holocaust. Baltic nationalists have referred to the genocide that they suffered at the hands of the Soviets. Poles have referred to the genocide that was perpetrated against them in 1943 in Volhynia at the hands of Ukrainians. Hungarians have even referred to a cultural genocide that they experienced in 1920, 100 years ago, with the Treaty of Trianon. So if you can focus on yourself as the victim, especially the victim of a massive epochal crime like genocide, well, then you can start changing the narrative. A third element that accompanies this is the desire to rehabilitate one's own notorious perpetrators and to demonize who we, of course, in this session would refer to as the real victims. So the Forward, in fact, has a new article online today talking about all the monuments that exist across Eastern Europe to Nazi collaborators who worked against the Soviets, like the Ukrainian nationalist Stepan Bandera. You see countless other lesser known pro-Nazi or Nazi collaborationist figures who have sparked debates in Eastern European countries in recent years. At the same time, the demonization of the victims can be seen in the fate of scholars like Jan Gross or Yitzhak Arad, people who have been, unearthing the truth of the Nazi years and the Holocaust, but who have now been defamed by right-wing nationalist groups, and even in the court system have been sued for having either been the haters of Poles or even Nazi collaborators in the case of Yitzhak Arad himself. A fourth element is that a lot of these illiberal democratic regimes actually pass laws mandating their revisionist views of history, so that there are laws in Eastern European countries against what's called genocide denial, the denial of the suffering of Eastern Europeans at the hands of the Soviets. There's a Russian law against falsifying history that will put you in jail if you question the motives of Stalin in the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, and Trump's 1776 commission mandating patriotic history as a way of using the law to try and advance this kind of a nationalist agenda. A fifth element, of course, is the use of memorials and museums to try and advance this kind of a narrative. So in Poland and in places like Hungary, Ukraine, there have been new museums and memorials built in recent years to glorify the Polish armed struggle against the Nazis, to, as with the House of Terror in Budapest, to focus on the Hungarian victims of the Nazis, and of course, shift attention away from either perpetration, crimes against Jews, or collaboration. In fact, just a couple months ago in Budapest, there's a brand new memorial dedicated to, it's called the Memorial of National Unity, that documents the more than 10,000 communities that Hungary lost in the Treaty of Trianon to Romania or other parts of Eastern Europe, when Hungary lost 2/3 of their population, its population. So, if you perpetrate, or if you rather perpetuate a narrative of victimization nonstop, you'll help reinforce that. The last 2 points I'll just make by way of kind of wrapping up what's a really, just a general overview here, is that some regimes go so far as to actually fabricate historical, we can't call them facts, they're non-facts. But with respect to what we'll talk about later with regard to, being in a post-truth world, the PIS in Poland has very notoriously endorsed the legend that 200,000 Poles were murdered in an extermination camp in Warsaw. That's been endorsed both in memorial form and by various politicians, whereas of course the facts are anything but. It's probably 5,000 to 10,000 Poles lost their lives in this KL Warsaw, as it was known, but there was no gas chamber there. There was not victims in the hundreds of thousands, and yet it's part of the emerging historical narrative. Wendy knows more about this next point than I do, but Ukrainian estimates of the death toll of the famine, the Holodomor, conventionally 3 million have been described as high as 10 million. So if governments are going to simply play fast and loose with facts, we're in a whole heap of trouble. And actually, there are 1 or 2 other points that I could mention. I think I'll leave them off just for the sake of time. But generally speaking, I will echo the idea that none of this is 100% new. There have been conservative and right-wing tendencies to resent and work against liberal memory, really for the last generation, if not for the entire post-war period. However, it's once these memory strategies are being embraced by governments or movements that actually seize power or take power through the existing electoral system that they can become more weaponized, given an official stamp of approval. And certainly for the advocates of liberal memory, we need to be very much aware of how illiberal memory functions, how it can be counteracted, so that we don't cede this territory to people who want to distort historical reality.
Thank you, Gabriel. You talked a lot about the narrative of victimization and how governments use it. I was gonna ask Nicholas, who has been following the developments in Germany over the last year, and Germany is always held up as this good example for Holocaust remembrance, how you deal with your past. And I'm just curious to hear from you, Nicholas, what sort of forms of anti-Semitism have we seen on the streets in Germany, and how does also, because our main topic here today is also how we can engage in Holocaust remembrance on social media. So I wanted to ask you how those how does the anti-Semitism that is now also seen on the streets of Germany manifest itself online, and how can we counter it?
Well, first of all, I think Germany always likes to be best at things. Historically, this hasn't worked out particularly well for the country. When it comes to remembrance, they quite like to see themselves as kind of the Holocaust remembrance world champions. They're often praised as a good example abroad. I would contradict this and say that I don't really think this is the case. At the beginning of this talk, in her introduction, Congresswoman Harman mentioned the Jewish Claims Conference study, which showed that 2/3 of young Americans didn't know 6 million Jews died, a half couldn't name a single concentration camp or ghetto. From a German perspective, the situation is only marginally better in Germany. So a CNN study actually from 2018 was able to show that in Germany, 40% of 18 to 34-year-olds knew little to nothing about the Holocaust. In Europe, more generally, 1 out of 20 Europeans hadn't heard of the Holocaust. In France, the number was as high as 1 in 5. So first of all, I think that there's definitely a sort of a mismatch between how Germany sees itself dealing with the past and what is actually the case. Another interesting example that's been talked about a lot today for International Holocaust Remembrance Day in Germany again is the newspaper Die Zeit was able to find out in a study that 1/3 of Germans think their relatives were resistance fighters in National Socialism or helped Jews. This is obviously just not true, that a third of the population under National Socialism was somehow engaged in active resistance against the regime. 10% even believe that their families hid Jews in their homes. In reality, there were about 10,000 active non-Jewish helpers. So from a population of 60 million back then, by my calculations, that makes 0.016% of Germans. So we see this mismatch. I think this becomes particularly interesting when we look at, bizarrely, the demonstrations over the last 9 months against the pandemic hygiene measures. So there's been this wide movement in Germany called Querdenken, which basically translates as lateral thinking or think outside the box types. And it's a very sort of broad church of esoteric hippies, organized violent neo-Nazis, anti-Semitic conspiracy ideologues, and everything in between. They've been holding lots of demonstrations across Germany against what they see as a corona dictatorship. And here we've seen a lot of parallels, or they're trying to draw parallels with National Socialism. They're basically saying that any hygiene measures are a new kind of enabling act, similar to that which Hitler passed in 1933. They're using the crude analogy of saying that any kind of proof of being vaccinated is basically the same as having to wear a yellow Jew star, as was done under National Socialism. And some people in high-profile cases, a student called Jana from Kassel even said that she felt just like Sophie Scholl, a member of the White Rose resistance group, whereas an 11-year-old girl said because her birthday party was cancelled due to corona measures, she felt just like Anne Frank. Both these videos went viral. They were widely discussed in Germany. So I think we're already seeing that far from being this champion of remembrance when it comes to the Holocaust, there's sort of like, on the one hand, a crude ignorance and a lot of misunderstandings about the Holocaust on the one hand. On the other hand, this tendency in Germany to somehow deal with the guilt of the past by portraying themselves as the victims, portraying themselves as the new Jews of some kind of unjust regime to fight the coronavirus. And I think this is particularly problematic. That said, I think anti-Semitism was a massive problem in Germany already before last year. Just to tell you a few figures, last year, according to one study, the number of anti-Semitic crimes rose by 13%. So there was 2,000 recorded anti-Semitic incidents, which means there's more than 5 a day. This is sort of the climate we're dealing in Germany, on the one hand, where they would like to see themselves as a country that had atoned for its sins in its past, but the reality is still a deep-seated anti-Semitism that's now is manifesting itself very clearly through these anti-corona protests, through the crude analogies, the symbolism, and everything that goes with it. And to touch upon the last part of your question, so what can we do about this? Well, I mean, the figures I've already mentioned point clearly to the fact that history lessons aren't really working, which is a problem. a lot of young people are spending their time on social media, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's without problems or challenges. Trying to communicate the Holocaust on social media can go very, very wrong. There are lots of examples of it going very, very wrong. A recent example from summer was on the streaming platform TikTok, that young people were basically drawing bruises on their face with makeup and sort of wearing scarves and playing sad violin music and basically miming fake stories, pretending that they were Holocaust victims, that they had been sent to the gas chambers in Auschwitz. And they weren't doing it to necessarily mock victims of the Holocaust. These were young people who were trying to connect with it, but sort of failing. And this shows that social media I mean, ideally you want young people to sort of engage in it with and internalize the horrors of the Holocaust. But on the other hand, it can very quickly be very tasteless. And another good example of this is selfies on social media. So lots of people go to Auschwitz, they go on the famous train tracks, they shoot their selfie. But if you strip this of any context, if you don't really mention why you're visiting Auschwitz and what actually happened there, if it's just some kind of background for you to get likes on Instagram, then this is probably problematic and tasteless. So I think we're walking a very fine line, where on the one hand, social media is key to reaching young people. On the other hand, a lot can go wrong. So yeah, even to name a few good examples, for example, Eva Stories was launched by an Israeli tech millionaire. It was a huge multi-million-dollar budget production, like 400 people worked on it. And through Instagram and TikTok, they basically told the story of Eva Heman, who was a 13-year-old Jew from Hungary who was deported to Auschwitz and murdered. This made her story accessible to a new generation, but in Israel, it was still met with some criticism. People feel as though it's a bit tasteless to combine such a fate with hashtags on this medium. So I think it's obviously always going to be a sensitive issue. I guess the best you can do is sort of listen to those affected by anti-Semitism and those who survived the Holocaust while they're still around, and sort of get their take on it, I guess. But you can, yeah, it's a fine line to tread, and there are a lot of challenges that can, yeah.
Thank you, Nicholas. I wanted to ask all of our panelists in the same vein that you just talked about Holocaust education or remembrance online, and that it's a fine line to walk, and also mentioning what Gabriel and Wendy talked about earlier, how there's sort of increasingly governments are replacing sort of liberal education with illiberal education on the Holocaust in some cases. This is a very broad question. Do we need a different approach to Holocaust remembrance in this century? First of all, given that the Holocaust survivors are not going to be among us in the future, and also question about that too: should the burden be on them to always to share their stories? Because I think that takes off the burden from a lot of other people. And then I wanted to ask, is it more important to educate people, or that they have an emotional understanding about the Holocaust, the significance of the Holocaust, or should they both be nurtured in parallel, and they're both equally important? And please feel free to jump in and answer.
I was struck by a lot of the points that my colleagues made in their presentations, and the concept of illiberal memory, and what's going on in Germany as far as this kind of crass or crude, misappropriation of the Holocaust, and real issues of decorum and etiquette and behavior and lack of boundaries and attention seeking and nationalizing of history. And it becomes very murky, because it's certain ways of behavior that we find very offensive. Of course, we want to uphold the freedom of speech and expression and so forth, but how is it that we've gotten to a point where there just seem to be no boundaries on these issues, or a sense of respect, and that in fact just the opposite, that breaking through those boundaries is in fact is the goal, right? So it's driven by a kind of variety of motives and developments. It's really hard to pin down. My own sense is that certain very basic fundamental things need to be reaffirmed as far as memory versus history and scientific inquiry. And I know this all sounds very academic, but somehow in our education system, those distinctions are not being preserved, whether it's objectivity and subjectivity, and method versus just, just certain, I don't want to use the word values because that's also too hard to define. But there's something that's gone on in the way that we interact with young people in the classroom and outside the classroom. That it's not working. And again, I feel like we're in this kind of quicksand moment, and I don't have an easy answer. I only know that the adults are not really also not modeling very good behavior and not doing things, that should be done, that we're seeing in the classroom as we socialize the youth all the way up through university. So I look to my colleagues right now. I don't have an easy answer to this.
Let me pick up with a couple of other comments on what Wendy was just saying. I think there has been a tendency among a lot of liberals to be overly self-critical, that somehow we failed. That what we've been doing for decades now, really since the 1970s and 80s when Holocaust education became a phenomenon, that somehow we've made mistakes, we should have done this, we should have done that. My own perspective, and I sort of elaborate on this in my essay, is that we are facing really unprecedented competition now from a variety of sort of information sources on the internet, which was of course conceived as a stream of easily accessible information, but has become a sewer, bringing all kinds of marginal, crank, esoteric, and outright hateful views, and polluting the stream of knowledge with a lot of stuff that's really hard for kids to filter out, let alone adults as well. I think that if we can learn anything from the Germans, and what Nicholas was saying, I think is very well taken. They've made important achievements, certainly at the level of official memory and government policy. But to say the Germans have done the best job of any population on earth, I mean, that's a pretty low bar. I mean, given how horrible the things were that took place under Nazi Germany, not to mention how also miserably poorly most other nations have done. So, we can maybe talk about that more at a different point. But the Germans, certainly after the traumas of 12 years of National Socialist dictatorship, they took a very different attitude towards issues of free speech that may be able to at least give us some, material to consider. I think now about the lawsuits against Alex Jones and Rudy Giuliani. I think about the deplatforming of Trump from Twitter. I'm thinking about the fact that in Germany since 1959, there have been laws against hate speech that violate human dignity. And while I historically have been pretty much, I wouldn't call myself 100% free speech absolutist, because I'm well aware of the fact that laws against free speech or that limit free speech can be weaponized by any kind of government. There may be a point that we're going to be reaching soon where we have to take the attitude of promoting what was called defensible or defensive-minded democracy, which the Germans, of course, did after 1945. They weren't going to simply allow Nazis to come back into the post-war liberal democratic order, use the tolerance of liberal society to undermine that liberal society. And so maybe, just as America had to crack down on the radio airwaves under FDR when Father Coughlin was broadcasting hateful ideas, and that's where we got the Mayflower Doctrine and later the Fairness Doctrine, which really ruled the American TV and radio world for 40 years until it was dismantled under Reagan. We have such a Wild West frontier of unregulated speech that has promoted only the worst kinds of his conspiracies and hateful mistruths that have taken our country even a more polarized direction. I wouldn't be surprised to see legislation being brought forward at some point to re-regulate some of the things that in American life have become overly deregulated. And speech may just be one of many things, but I at least would like to have a discussion about what might profitably be learned from Germany's effort after World War II to really reinforce democratic norms against people who would try and undermine them.
One point I would like to make, sort of touching on what Wendy said, of what can we still do, especially while survivors are still with us. I think that efforts to digitalize the testimonies from survivors are very, very important. I'm looking at the Shoah Foundation in America, for example, and they've recorded tens of thousands of interviews since the 90s. I also, in my research, have found this Dimensions in Testimony program they had. For example, at the Illinois Holocaust Museum, there is this survivor stories experience, and you can actually see 3D holograms of Holocaust survivors that basically answer your questions based on buzzwords that you say. I think this kind of digitalization is important to preserve this knowledge, especially as our living knowledge, unfortunately, is dwindling. This is one thing where I'd say that Germany sort of missed a chance as well. I think that there was a lot of skepticism for many decades about these kind of digital formats. I think another problem is that then not enough money was invested in Germany in, for example, like recording and digitalizing all of these survivor testimonies, whereas the USA did a much better job there. But also, obviously, I think that a lot more survivors, I don't have any numbers off the top of my head, but not that many survivors of the Holocaust still live in Germany, as in comparison to, say, Israel or the USA.
Thank you. I'm gonna go over now to the Q&A, and I'm gonna repeat one more time. If you have a question, send it to us via email, and our email address is gep@wilsoncenter.org. And I'm gonna group two questions sort of, or actually three together and make them two questions, and you feel free to take each of them or just one of them. So we got one question that is basically asking, what are some sources that actually celebrate Jewish culture more broadly? Because, it's also maybe a problem if children just learn about the Holocaust and nothing else. And that's sort of the only category that they have to talk about Jewish life. So I was wondering if you have any examples, good examples, online examples, if possible, for how we can celebrate Jewish culture more in schools, but also more broadly. And then the other question touches a little bit upon this sort of, especially here in America, this notion that different people have a different past. So African Americans have to, were formerly slaves in the U.S. has never really, really confronted its past on that. And you have sort of different groups playing each other out or saying, well, it's time we move on from talking about the Holocaust because there are so many more issues going on that we have never talked about. So I'm just curious, how do we sort of walk this fine line to include other experiences as well, but still, make clear that the Holocaust was a singular event.
I'm going to just jump in on the source question and maybe touch on the second question and thank the audience for their really thoughtful questions. Absolutely, there are a lot of sources that we could say kind of humanize the victims, the Jewish victims, that recapture what was lost during the Holocaust, their cultural heritage, practices, beliefs, traditions. And I mentioned the Ringelblum archive, for instance, which the intention of that in part was to actually preserve that like a time capsule so that we could delve back into it. In like today, I was quoting from it. And there's a lot of material in there that has been digitized and translated and written about. A lot of it is at the Holocaust, on the Holocaust Museum's website. They have also a program, a digital program called Experiencing History, where they have translated these sources from Yiddish and all the different European languages, diaries, songs, operas from the Terezin Ghetto. So we have, and even when we get into the testimonies that are online from the Shoah Foundation or here the Fortunoff Archive at Yale, many of the testimonies contain a lot of rich and thick and beautiful descriptions of what we call kind of life before, of Jewish life before. And sometimes the survivors are singing songs and showing pictures and can really, for those who are watching these testimonies and studying them, really get a sense of what was lost and who these people were and what we have still, what remains, what the continuities as far as survivors that came to America and Jewish life in America and those connections to Europe. Yes, on the African-American experience, we can learn from each other. And part of the problem is what I mentioned in my opening remarks about kind of the ethnicization and identity politics that are attached to history, our history, your history. And I've heard this so many times. Often people ask me, because I'm interested in the Holocaust and worked at the museum, are you Jewish? Like that has to be a kind of starting point. Or when I've traveled abroad, whether it's Rwanda or gone to the Hiroshima Museum in Japan, I hear, other communities saying, that's your history, the Jewish history is that history, and this is our history. And those kinds of, siloing, that kind of separation of yours and ours is really, I think, not a good place to start, because actually we all learn from each other these histories. And, Holocaust historians have been talking about racism, segregation, whether it's, the Nuremberg laws, eugenics, international eugenics movement, the kind of process of dehumanization, the way it exists in the infrastructure, how it continues. These are the themes, hierarchies of power, kind of caste systems. These have been part of our research for decades. And I think, working with the African-American community and with our students and opening up those dialogues, those conversations is absolutely important, because we have, we can both gain by that dialogue. And one of the ways to keep the memory alive is to not think of genocide studies as, my genocide, your genocide, but as this much larger global history across time and space. And those shared histories are door openers. And can, kind of break down those barriers that seem to be erected when we get too obsessed with history as identity.
Yeah, I would echo Wendy's comments and expand a little bit further, I suppose. This question of whether Holocaust consciousness promotes or impedes the attention that other groups receive for their historical sufferings. It's a debate that really goes back to the early 1990s, when the US Holocaust Memorial Museum was dedicated in 1993, if I'm not mistaken, at a time when many critics 1 year earlier had been marking the quincentennial of the quote unquote discovery of the New World by Columbus and the Europeans, and of course proceeded to promote what many have called a genocide of Native peoples. And for a lot of certainly African Americans, Native Americans, the idea that the Holocaust should get a major museum just off the Federal Mall at a time when still attention towards slavery and Native American genocide was underdeveloped, if anything, at least brought into discussion the possibility that too much Holocaust consciousness equals the negation of other people's experiences. Well, of course, what we know is that there have subsequently been major moves to acknowledge the experience both of Native Americans on the Mall in DC in the form of the Native American History Museum, the more recently dedicated museum to the African American historical experience. And my argument has always been that, as Wendy was saying, Holocaust consciousness promotes and broadens the understanding towards the suffering of all kinds of peoples, regardless of time or place. And just to put a finer point on this in terms of political alliances and strategies, I've been working recently on a new article comparing all the new streaming dramas online that deal with the question of if the Nazis had won World War II, or if white nationalists came back today and were trying to promote, some kind of new Jim Crow against African Americans and other minorities. I'm thinking here about The Plot Against America, The Man in the High Castle, the one that just won 11 Emmys, The Watchmen, and of course, there's an Amazon Prime Hunters with Al Pacino focusing on Jewish Nazi hunters, trying to track down neo-Nazis in America. One of the interesting subplots of all four of those shows is that Blacks and Jews are always shown in alliance with one another, that they need to resist the common enemy that is threatening to oppress them both. And when I think of John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock just coming out of the Georgia Senate races, winning those two seats that changed the balance of power in the Senate, I mean, without saying it has to be limited to Blacks and Jews, that kind of inter-communal, inter-ethnic, religious solidarity extended to many other groups who, of course, feel very invested in fighting against the far right. That's something I think is very worth promoting. And if we have to listen a little bit more to each other's historical experiences as part of that, I mean, I think that's a win-win.
I would just like to touch on the question we had about how can we then celebrate Jewish life and how can we find positive examples and not always focus on sort of the negative side of things. And in Germany, this is obviously a problem. And the Jewish German author Max Czolek has also rightly said that Jews in Germany are often only seen through the prism of Israel, anti-Semitism, and the Holocaust. And it's very hard to break out of this. So how can we celebrate Jewish life and culture? I think obviously alongside the many countless tragedies of National Socialism is that the Weimar Republic in Germany was culturally and politically incredibly progressive and interesting. It was light years ahead of its time, and we lost all of that. So I think a positive example in Berlin is the Jewish Australian opera director Barry Kosky, who's a director at the Komische Oper. He's in the previous years, he's been finding basically lost operettas from the Weimar Republic, amongst others from Jewish composers, and basically giving them a new life. I mean, these were hits back in their day, but they were also wiped out. A lot of these composers, the ones who managed to escape alive, never were able to recover the career that they had before. For example, in the case of Jeremy Weinberger, he later killed himself in the USA. He never really wrote a successful opera again. So I think that one thing we can do is to sort of focus on the lost culture and to try and celebrate it somehow and give it a second life.
Thank you. I see we're almost running out of time, but I want to ask Nicholas one question that we got about the German population. Someone is wondering if there are any differences between Germans who live in the former East Germany versus West Germany in the type of knowledge they have about the Holocaust, and if there are any, where those differences might stem from.
Yeah, well, in the former socialist East German regime in the GDR, it was basically the state doctrine that it was an anti-fascist state. There weren't any Nazis because there couldn't be, and that they basically, they had a top-down approach where more or less from day one, they sort of saw themselves as a country that had successfully ridded itself of its fascist past, which we obviously know isn't true. What this actually meant is that they never really had the societal confrontation in the same way that, say, West Germany did. Not that West Germany did everything right, but obviously it came later with Fritz Bauer, with the Auschwitz trials, with things like this. So I think what we're seeing now is that, especially since the fall of the wall, there's been an explosion in far-right extremism in the east of Germany, and that this is a real problem that has lots of different causes, but one of them is the way in which the guilt of the Holocaust was dealt with in former East Germany. I see that we are out of time, so I hope I've been able to give an okay answer to a very complicated question that I could talk about for days.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I want to thank our panelists for this very insightful discussion. And I believe we could go on for hours and hours because there's so much to discuss. I also want to thank you for sharing the lessons of the Holocaust with our audience. And I think this panel today couldn't be more relevant in the present times. So thank you for everybody for listening in and tuning in. Take care, everyone. Thank you.